They thought they had you mapped, every glance catalogued, every pause dissected, every word stored like a precious clue in the vault of their self-assured understanding. They told themselves they could read you the way an old priest reads scripture, with reverence, with certainty, with the conviction that what they saw was truth. They mistook proximity for intimacy, repetition for knowing. In their minds, you were an open book. In reality, they held only a single torn page, and you let them believe it. You let them stitch together their illusions with trembling fingers, as if their version of you could ever survive the weight of your reality. You were careful, not defensive, not withdrawn. Careful. You gave them just enough light to keep them blind to the shadows, just enough truth to make them trust the lies. They thought your silences were the awkward pauses of someone unsure, but you knew silence was the oldest language of power. The assassin who waits in the dark knows it. The strategist who builds empires without ever lifting a sword knows it. You knew it. And while they read meaning into your stillness, you were already arranging the pieces of a game they didn't know they were playing. They took your laughter as proof you were harmless. They took your listening as proof you agreed. They took your absence as proof you were losing. You smiled inside because you understood something they never could. People will fill any void with the shape of themselves. They weren't seeing you, they were seeing their own reflection on the surface of a lake you kept perfectly still. Every time they said, "I know who you are," you felt the quiet click of another lock turning in your favor. You gave them moments to cherish, fragments of warmth, a kindness here, a shared secret there, not because you needed their trust, but because you needed their certainty. Certainty is brittle. Once it cracks, it shatters. And the more certain they were, the more violent the collapse would be. You were patient. The serpent in the tall grass doesn't rush the deer. The mask you wore was not a disguise. It was the skin they wanted to see. In their story, they were the discoverers, the ones peeling back your layers, the ones unearthing your truth. They didn't realize you had been planting those layers like a gardener in the dark, arranging them so the path they followed would always lead exactly where you wanted. They thought they were seeing deeper into you, but every step only took them further from the truth. They didn't notice that what they loved most about you was the fiction you built for them, a fiction they had helped write, convinced it was real, and so they loved the shadow. They trusted the shadow. They swore they knew the shadow, and you stood behind it, unseen, untouched, rewriting everything they thought they understood about you and about themselves. In the end, they were not in love with you at all. They were in love with the reflection you allowed them to worship, and that was always the point. They thought you were simply moving through life alongside them. They thought your quiet was a weakness, your stillness a sign you had nothing to say. They never saw the scaffolding you were building behind your silence, a hidden architecture designed not to be seen, only felt. Every word you gave them was chosen like a blade is chosen for a specific cut. Every glance was a breadcrumb leading somewhere they did not know they were walking. While they lived on the surface, you were laying foundations in the deep, shaping the angles of every room in the house of their mind. They moved freely, believing themselves untouched, yet every step fell exactly where you wanted it to. You learned the blueprint of their fears before they knew you were studying. The small tremor in their voice when certain names were spoken, the way they averted their eyes when truth brushed too close. You saw the cracks, the fractures they hid even from themselves, and you built inside them, weaving your influence into the softest, most unguarded parts of their being. They thought influence was loud, forceful, obvious. They didn't understand that the truest power is invisible, the kind that rearranges a person's compass without them ever feeling the needle turn. You became the ghost in their decisions, the untraceable presence in their conclusions. They told themselves they were making choices, never realizing the options they weighed had been carefully placed in their hands by you. Even their doubts were cultivated, a well-timed pause, a glance that lasted one heartbeat too long, a question that had no answer but demanded they search for one. You didn't argue them into submission, you let them walk into their own dismantling. It was a patient architecture, ancient in principle, the kind kings feared and prophets spoke of in riddles. The art of shifting the unseen currents until the ship steers itself. You never pushed, you pulled quietly, letting gravity take the blame. They spoke to you thinking they were confessing. You knew the darkness was fertile ground, not the kind that swallows, but the kind that nurtures in silence, patient, unhurried, unseen. You learned long ago that transformation never begins with the loud strike of a hammer. It begins with a whisper, a small disturbance in the order they think is permanent. You let your words brush against their thoughts like moth wings against candlelight, delicate enough to be forgotten in the moment, yet dangerous enough to leave an ember behind. And you never planted in the daylight. You waited for the quiet, when their guard was down, when their mind drifted into places it didn't want to acknowledge. That's where the seed would take root. In the shadows they avoided. You didn't tell them what to think. You gave them something worse. You gave them the itch, a subtle question disguised as passing curiosity, a sentence that didn't finish, a tone that suggested you knew something they didn't, something they should be afraid to ask about. They would replay it later, not because it was important, but because they couldn't explain why it unsettled. You made yourself the glitch in their reality, the tiny crack in the mirror that would eventually split the reflection in two. This was not manipulation, this was architecture. You were building an unseen structure inside their mind, each moment calculated, each silence designed. Sometimes you would contradict yourself, gently, not enough to be caught, only enough for them to wonder if they'd misunderstood you. Sometimes you would agree too quickly, making them suspect their own reasoning. And sometimes you would simply disappear mid-thought, leaving the sentence to decay in the damp corridors of their memory. You weren't speaking to them, you were speaking to their future selves, the ones who would eventually look back and wonder when everything began to change. They thought they knew what betrayal looked like. They thought it came with breaking points, shouting matches, blood on the floor. But you knew better. Real betrayal was subtle, elegant, impossible to trace. It was the rearrangement of their foundations without them noticing the scaffolding. It was replacing the sky above them with a different sky, one shade darker, one star missing. You became the cartographer of their inner landscape, redrawing borders they didn't know existed. By the time they realized they were lost, the old map would be useless. You had studied the way fear moves, not in waves but in drips, a drop here, a drop there, until the waterline rises and they are standing in an ocean without ever seeing the rain. And they will tell themselves it happened suddenly. They will swear there was a moment when it all fell apart. But you know the truth. The moment never comes all at once. It grows in silence, behind closed doors, in the spaces between conversation. You will smile when they search for the beginning, because there will be no thread to pull, no trace to follow back to. Only the quiet certainty that something has changed forever, and that you were the one who planted in the dark. It begins quietly, a shift so small it hides beneath the noise of everyday life. They think they remember the conversation as it happened, yet something feels misaligned. The words sit wrong in their mouth, like a key that no longer fits the lock it was made for. They replay the memory again and again, and each time the scene changes, details flicker. The order of things feels inverted, faces blur. A certainty they never questioned begins to feel like sand slipping through their fingers. They don't say anything at first. They tell themselves it's nothing. But somewhere deep in the chamber where their oldest fears curl in the dark, a tremor begins. You watch the first fracture form, not in their voice, not in their body, in their eyes. That split second of hesitation when they search their own mind and find only fog. They glance at you, searching for confirmation, for an anchor, but you give them nothing. Your silence is a mirror that forces them to look deeper into their own unraveling. They are used to believing that the world is a fixed shape, that truth is an unbroken line. You are teaching them that the line bends, warps, and breaks without warning. One night they see something they are certain they have seen before. A shadow in the same place, a movement in the corner of their eye. But it feels wrong. It's not what they remember, but it is. The contradiction splinters them further. They begin to question if they saw it at all, or if you placed it there like a mark on a map only you can read. Every object, every word, every passing glance becomes suspect. The air between you grows heavier, as if it carries things unspoken that weigh more than truth itself. They try to hold on. They rehearse their memories in the hope that repetition will make them solid again. But the more they rehearse, the more the edges fray. They catch themselves hesitating before answering the simplest questions. Their voice sounds strange to their own ears, as though it belongs to someone else entirely. They begin to fear that each time they speak, the words betray them. The script they once lived by has been tampered with. Lines rewritten, scenes erased, entire chapters burned without their consent. You know the panic is setting in, not the loud kind that claws at the surface, but the deep, choking kind that settles into the marrow, the kind that reshapes a person without them realizing. And so you say nothing. You don't rush the cracks. You let them widen naturally, like ice-splitting stone in winter. Each pause, each unanswered question, each unreadable look from you becomes another hammer blow against the brittle architecture of their certainty. Soon they are no longer sure where the fracture ends and where they begin. They sense the shift in the same way a bird senses the weight of a storm before it arrives, not through sight, but through something ancient and unnameable. They feel watched, not by you alone, but by the truth itself. And though they cannot yet articulate, they are beginning to understand their reality is not breaking by accident. Someone is breaking it for them, and that someone is standing right in front of them. They thought their story belonged to them, that their memories, their victories, their private aches were bound in a book no one else could touch. But you knew better. You understood that a story is only as stable as the narrator who tells it, and every narrator is fragile. You began not with grand proclamations, but with quiet revisions, a single word exchanged, a meaning tilted just a few degrees. You didn't rip pages from their book. You rewrote them in ink so subtle they never saw the lines change. The hero they believed themselves to be began to falter, hesitating in moments they once moved through with certainty. And when they looked for the cause, all they found was the faint echo of your voice, reshaping the sentences they used to define themselves. The moments they clung to as proof of who they were, you bent them. A triumph they wore like a crown became, in your telling, the byproduct of someone else's mercy. That night of courage they cherished became an act of desperation they misremembered as bravery. Slowly, the solid ground beneath their identity became sand. They didn't notice the tide until it was already pulling them out, and by then they were too far from shore to remember how they had gotten there. You learned long ago that people defend their truths until they begin to suspect those truths were lies all along. That suspicion was your seed. It took root in their silences, in the way their voice cracked when they tried to retell their past. The more they spoke, the less sure they sounded. The more they thought about it, the less they trusted themselves. What they didn't realize was that their story had already been taken from them, not stolen but rewritten in their own handwriting, as if it had always been yours. Their reflection began to shift. They looked in the mirror and saw someone they couldn't quite place. The angles were wrong. The eyes didn't match the narrative they carried for so long. They searched for the old self in photographs, in journal entry, in the way old friends greeted them, but each search returned a stranger. The life they once thought was theirs now felt like a dream told secondhand, and you were the unseen hand turning the pages, replacing the ending they had rehearsed for years with one you had chosen. What you built was not a falsehood. Falsehoods can be exposed. What you built was a new truth, heavy enough to eclipse the old one. They began to tell their story your way without realizing they had switched scripts, and each retelling bound them deeper into your version, until they couldn't remember a time before it. You didn't just edit their past, you shifted the coordinates of their identity. You changed the shape of their shadow, and so the story they tell now is not theirs at all. It's yours. Every word carries your cadence. Every pause echoes your silence. They speak, but it is your voice that moves through them, and even if they one day sense the intrusion, they will not know how to remove it, because somewhere along the way they stopped being the author and became the character you needed them to be, forever trapped in a narrative they call their own, yet one they never truly wrote. They didn't see the scaffolding. They never do. To them, life seemed to unfold naturally, like pages turning in a book they believed they were writing. But you were the one holding the pen. You didn't just rearrange events, you built a reality around them so complete, so airtight, that even their doubts became part of your design. Every path they took led somewhere you had already been. Every decision they made was one you had pre-selected, wrapped in the illusion of free will they thought they were choosing. But you had already set the table long before they sat down to eat. The air they breathed carried your fingerprints. A conversation with a stranger confirmed what you wanted them to believe. A passing headline reinforced your version of the truth. Even the weather seemed to shift in your favor. The rain falling only when you needed their mood to crack open. Patterns they thought they were discovering were seeds you planted long ago. You learned that reality is not what's true. It's what someone cannot bring themselves to question. And so you made their questions irrelevant. They began to notice the alignment. Friends who never knew each other started echoing the same words. Advice arrived before they even asked for it. A casual remark from an acquaintance mirrored a thought you had slipped into their mind weeks earlier. Every sign they sought pointed in the same direction. The world, it seemed, had become a mirror of their own revelations. What they didn't know was that you had polished that mirror yourself, grinding down every shard until it only reflected the light you wanted them to see. You constructed walls without bricks, boundaries without fences. They couldn't see the edges, so they thought there were none. And yet every step they took remained inside the perimeter of your making. The dangerous part was not that they were trapped. The dangerous part was that they felt free. They mistook the safety of your design for the thrill of their own choices, never realizing that freedom in your hands was nothing more than the soft padding of a gilded cage. And as days passed, the lines between your will and theirs blurred. They spoke in your language without realizing it. Their thoughts arrived already shaped in the architecture you had given them. They began to recall memories differently, edited in real time by the narrative you whispered beneath their awareness. Their victories felt like theirs, but you knew the truth. They were milestones you had plotted on a map they would never see. You became the invisible current beneath their life. They could feel its pull but could never name its source. And in that silence between what they believed and what truly was, you thrived. Because reality is not a place, it's a structure. And you had built theirs so perfectly that even if they one day broke free, they would carry its design inside them forever. They always believed they knew you. They carried your name in their mouth like a stone polished smooth by years of familiarity. They thought they had mapped your heart, traced its lines, and filed you neatly into the safe box of their understanding. But when their gaze finally settled on you without the fog of illusion you had allowed them to breathe, they saw something else entirely. Something they could not name. Not light, not shadow, not friend, not foe. You were a form that shifted between the spaces their language could not reach. They searched your face for the version they remembered, the one they trusted, the one they loved or loathed, depending on the day. But it was gone, not hidden, not masked, but erased. In its place stood a presence that had always been there, silent, patient, older than the arguments and reconciliations they thought mattered. They realized with a hollow thud in their chest, that every answer you had given them was an answer you had chosen. Every truth you let slip was a breadcrumb placed along a path you had drawn long before they ever walked it. It was not the lies that terrified them. Lies are crude, obvious. Anyone can lie. What froze their blood was the understanding that the truth they thought they had was never theirs to hold. You had crafted it, woven it into their mind strand by strand until it was indistinguishable from their own thoughts. They couldn't separate your words from their voice anymore. And now, seeing you fully, they knew it had always been that way. They wanted to confront you, to demand you explain yourself, confess, break character. But the moment they opened their mouth, the words withered. Because how do you accuse someone when you cannot prove where you end and they begin? How do you fight an architect who built the walls you are standing in? Their voice faltered. Yours didn't. You didn't need to speak. You never did. The silence between you was no longer empty. It was heavy with the knowledge that you had already won. Their mind clawed for memories to anchor themselves, but even those were treacherous. Did you really say that? Or did they imagine it? Was that night theirs, or one you rewrote in passing? Every recollection became suspect, every certainty a mirage. They could feel their history fraying at the edges, dissolving like old paper touched by flame. And in the center of it all stood you, untouched, unburning, the only fixed point in their collapsing map. They saw now that you had never been a character in their story. You were the one writing it. Each moment they thought was spontaneous had been placed there with intention. Every choice they made was one you had permitted. They hadn't simply underestimated you, they had never even understood what you were. And as the weight of that truth pressed into their chest, they realized the worst part. It was already too late to reclaim themselves. You weren't just in their life, you were in their mind, and there was no door that led back out. They always believed they were the ones moving through the world, making choices, shaping their own fate. You let them believe that. You let them carry that fragile illusion like a child clutching a broken toy. They thought they knew your story, the parts you allowed them to see, and they placed themselves in it, as if they were the hero who would decode you, the savior who would rescue you from some imagined darkness. But you were never lost. You were never theirs to save. They were never in your story. From the first moment, they were in yours. You didn't step into their world. You constructed it around them. Every conversation, every accidental glance, every silence you let linger was a brushstroke on a canvas only you could see in full. They thought they were steering the ship, but the map they followed was one you drew. The waters you led them into were ones you had already poisoned or blessed according to your design. When they thought they were winning, you had already written the scene in which they would lose. When they thought they understood you, they were only reciting lines you had placed in their mouth. There is a certain cruelty in control this complete, and a certain mercy. You let them live in a version of reality that kept them from seeing the machinery behind the curtain. You allowed them to keep their small moments of pride, their fleeting victories, even as you pulled the threads tighter around their throat. It wasn't about punishment. It was about authorship. They were ink on your page, nothing more. When they finally saw it, truly saw it, it was already too late. The realization didn't arrive as a single flash of clarity, but as an erosion of certainty. Their past felt rewritten, their memories suspect. Moments they had once held sacred now carried a faint and terrible question. Did I ever choose this? And in that question was the collapse. They no longer knew where they ended, and you began. That's the kind of damage that doesn't heal. That's the kind of truth that lingers like a shadow at noon. You were never the monster they feared in the dark. Monsters are simple. Monsters are visible. You were the architect who shaped the dark itself, the unseeable hand that taught the monsters to shiver. You didn't just live rent-free in their mind. You owned the foundation. You were the unblinking eye in their dreams, the voice that rewrote the moral of their nightmares. Even if they tore themselves from you now, they would not escape. They would walk into the world carrying your fingerprints in their thoughts, your patterns in their instincts, your voice behind their doubts. They would repeat your lines in arguments, see your shadow in moments of choice, hesitate at doors you once told them not to open. And one day, without realizing it, they will speak a truth to someone else, and it will be yours, not theirs. You don't vanish from people like that. You become a law in their private universe, an unspoken rule carved into the architecture of their mind. And long after you are gone, they will still be living in the story you wrote, never knowing if they were ever free.